Welcome to this edition of Theological Journals, 2:42 p.m., July 1, 2020. Trinity Journal, Philip Derstine, on the ancient Israelite calendar. The plural form of Moed refers to Israel's festivals. The author of Genesis 1:14-16 is framing the calendrical purpose of luminaries, as explained by Bill Arnold. It seems likely that the author of Genesis 1 has set out intentionally to distinguish Israel's use of these phenomena as marks of sacred festivals from the Babylonian focus on divinatory readings of the signs. In Genesis 1, the signs of heaven have been transformed from divinatory guidelines to be read by the well-informed into a sacred calendar in the sky on display for all Israelites to follow. The Hebrew otot, signs, Genesis 1:14, is thus a broad category under which the rest of the terms of the calendar signifies that which is seen with the eyes. Twice it is used in connection with sacred festivals. Yahweh assures Israel that when the sign of blood is seen on the doorposts, he will pass over the Israelites. Every use of otot connotes something empirical. Footnote 25. Prophets give signs as pledges of predicted events. 1 Samuel 10:7. Otot is used of miracles confirming the divine presence, such as Moses' ability to stop and start leprosy, or turn the waters of the Nile into blood. The word ot describes the stone each tribe placed at the Jordan as a memorial in the parting of the Jordan, Joshua 4. Hence, it was the ideal rubric under which to lay out the parameters of the divine calendar. Precalculation of lunar conjunctions in perpetuity by the fixed calendar of Judaism in the Middle Ages supplanted the statutory imperative of Deuteronomy 16:1. You shall observe or watch for the new moon of Aviv, Shamor Eth Hodesh. One cannot fulfill this perennial obligation 1 year or 100 years ahead of time. In Jeremiah 31:35, the word for statutes, hukot, enshrines the role of the lunar and stellar luminaries, whose light is instrumental in conveying the set of time for offering Yahweh's sacrifices. Stars and the moon are pivotal in setting the correct time for the festival days themselves. The role of the stars, Genesis 1:16b, will be discussed below. The light of the moon is Yahweh's faithful, perennial witness in the skies, its speech capable of broadcasting to the world an inaudible source of knowledge. Psalm 19:2-4. The new moon made the essence of the lunar calendar accessible to anyone desiring to keep the festivals far from Jerusalem. Moreover, the practice conveyed a divine sense of unity and moment that predetermined calendars cannot. We'll resume this article again as we turn to Anglican and Episcopal History on the Lambeth Conferences, one which is ongoing as we speak, or has concluded its June 2022. His first article is on Lambeth Conferences, the Historiographies. This is a decennial meeting every 10 years. The volumes of 1920 and 29 were quite different. Some small changes. They were small. Davidson added to his narrative the briefest outline, totaling barely 5 pages, to collectively cover 1897 and 1908 conferences. A more detailed 15-page addition was made to the narrative in 1929 and covered the 1920 conference. He also made some corrections and minor alterations. Other changes were of greater import. The 1920 volume removed nearly 200 pages of sources found in the volume of 1889-96, much of which had been carried over from the 1888 compilation. It is no criticism to note that, beginning in 1920, the noise that defined the earlier conferences were cut to make room for the publishing of the formal proceedings of all conferences. The first, hi Mary, good to see you. The five Lambeth Conferences was furthermore wholly reorganized. It now presented only the official material from each Lambeth Conference, its attendees, public correspondence, resolutions, and reports. The same organization was maintained in the 6 Lambeth Conferences. Uniform and coherent, each successive volume was also progressively larger. The 6 Lambeth Conferences totaled more than 600 pages, rendering it a sizable amount of reading for any bishop. Perhaps it is fortunate that by modern standards, boat travel to the Lambeth Conference was comparatively slow. Stevenson's volumes. We turn from Davidson's volumes to Stevenson's works. When Davidson told the backstory of the Lambeth Conference, he began in 1865, when the desire for an Anglican council arose, strange to say, from the interest awakened in North America by the church affairs of South Africa. Within 3 pages, readers were perusing the opening of Longley's invitation of 1867. Alan M.G. Stevenson told a rather different story in the first Lambeth Conference, surveying the theological debates within the international Anglican world and the responses to these, both within and beyond the British Empire. Stevenson arrived at Longley's invitation to the Lambeth Conference of 1867 only in Chapter 10, which began on page 177. Instead of beginning with the Canadian request, his study opened with a chapter on the development of the moderate high churchman. Stevenson's 2 volumes, which total just over 600 pages, were predicated on the simple argument that the Lambeth Conference came from an internationally developed ecclesiology and one distinct from the tripartite division of high, low, and broad church parties that, beginning in the mid-19th century, became familiar shorthand for Anglican existence. Quote, the history of the conference has demonstrated the existence and the importance of moderate high churchmen, a party within the whole Anglican communion, who are working together for the extension of their own principles. They stand out as a group separate from evangelicals, broad churchmen, and tractarians, but they have not been studied as a group, and their relation to other groups has not been previously clarified. The first Lambeth Conference was primarily the work of moderate high churchmen. Davidson had not located the Lambeth Conference in any party, meaning that in 1967, when Stevenson published the first Lambeth Conference, he advanced a fundamentally new thesis. What is more, he offered for the first time an academic history that explained what had become by then a century-old tradition. Pick that up later. I want to get some of these volumes. We turn to Michael Ramsey an article in relation to Lambeth Conference, which was beginning in the 1968 Lambeth Conference to deal with religionless Christianity, the demythologization program of Rudolf Bultmann in the academies, and the death of God theology of the 1960s. And also from the United States, the work of Paul Van Buren, The Secular Meaning of the Gospel. And then later, Harvey Cox of Harvard, William Hamilton, and Thomas Eilitzer with the Death of God movement. It fell to Ramsey to deal with the fallout from Robinson's Honest to God. He was an Anglican bishop, and he later felt he had been slow to grasp the need which the book aimed to meet. But he was to return to the questions raised several times in his Scott Holland lectures in 1964, and in particular in his book, God, Christ, and the World, the preface to which is dated March 1968, weeks before the conference began. This intellectual disturbance went hand in hand with, in the UK at least, a rapid overturning of the historic Christian faith, Christian basis of the law as it touched on matters of morality, abortion, divorce, homosexuality, and capital punishment, among others. The new differentiation of crime from sin, Ramsey could hardly avoid. And indeed, he and his staff were deeply involved in framing the Church of England's response. Rather less sensational, but equally far-reaching, were the streams of ecumenical effort which were converging in the years immediately before the Lambeth Conference. The Second Vatican Council transformed Anglican expectations of ecumenical advance with the Roman Catholics. Ramsey himself made a highly symbolic visit to Pope Paul VI in March 1966. A joint preparatory commission of Anglicans and Roman Catholics convened as a result, delivering the so-called Malta Report in January 1968, which, though unpublished, was made available to the bishops at Lambeth. At just the same time, the process of rapprochement with the Methodist Church came in England, and that was on the cusp of fruition. The final details of a proposed scheme of reunion were published in April 1968. A reunion to be achieved by means seemed to nullify any prospect of progress with Rome. More than one scheme of reunion elsewhere in the Anglican communion was at or approaching a similar point of decision in North India and Pakistan, and in Ceylon and Nigeria. And as such, the decision in England was likely to be the determinant of those futures as well. Michael Ramsey, Ecumenism, Rome, Vatican II, Disruptive Theologies of the 1960s. The fruits the trees that were planted in the acorns of the late 19th century. We turn now to our third article on Lambeth Conference and its relationship to international relations. The unfolding of the Lambeth Conferences now coincided with a new parallel history of international institutions which sought to regulate the world's affairs. In 1843, the first of a succession of international peace conferences had taken place in London. These impressive gatherings sought to govern the conduct of war by conventions which would acquire legal authority. Thereafter, a general movement to regulate the conduct of war would gain powerful momentum. A new code of 157 articles, drafted by Francis Lieber, 1798 to 1872, and defining the proper conduct of war by Union forces in the American Civil War, was promulgated in April 1863 by President Abraham Lincoln. The first Geneva Convention was signed in 1865. Parts of the Lieber Code subsequently found their way into the Brussels Declaration of 1874. A long succession of Universal Peace Congresses was inaugurated in Paris in 1889. It was in this context that the 1897 Lambeth Conference set before the churches of the Anglican Communion 3 successive resolutions on international relations, 41, 42, 43. In these lay much of what would follow in the later meetings. The belief that arbitration could be claimed not merely as a practice, but a principle that expressed the teachings of Christ, that the matter of peace was both cause and duty, and something that involved the public conscience and appealed to enlightened public opinion, that all Christians had a duty to work for peace, that the duty could not be defined by prayer, private instruction, and public appeal. This was adopted by the encyclical published by the conference. Quote, "War is a horrible evil, followed usually by consequences worse than itself. Arbitration in place of war saves the honor of nations concerned, and yet determines the questions at issue with completeness. War brutalizes even while it gives opportunity for the finest heroism. Arbitration leaves behind it a generous sense of the passions restrained and justice fought for. The Church of Christ can never have any doubt of which of the 2 modes of determining national quarrels ought to survive." And we'll turn from that to the Standard Bearer and some articles on the May issue, which had articles on sexual abuse. And these are letters to the editor, and I pick up here just at the beginning of a third letter. "The second reason that I write is some concern with Reverend Key's meditation. This is from again, this is a commentary on a May edition. Before I state my concerns, please know that I highly respect Reverend Key and often choose to listen to his sermons on sermon audio. Please know that the concerns that I bring to you are not an attack on Reverend Key, but are my concerns for his article. I humbly acknowledge that my concerns may be a misunderstanding on my part. First, the article left me confused as to whom Reverend Key was addressing. In his introduction, he gives the impression that his article is for comfort and to assist in the restoration of spiritual peace to those who have been thrown into turmoil. From that, I make the assumption that the intention of the article is to bring comfort for the spiritual peace of men and women who've been violated and murdered by the abusive actions of another. I first read the article as a non-victim. I then reread the article as he intended, as if I were a victim. I humbly submit to you some of my concerns. After briefly addressing the destruction sexual abuse causes the victim, Reverend Key immediately addresses the victim's response. Reading as if I were a victim, the spiritual peace and balm I am in need of, first, to hear how God responds to the violence done against me. Psalm 12:5, Micah 6:8, Psalm 94, Psalm 11, Isaiah 61. As a victim, the comfort and peace that I am in desperate need of is to know that God saw that what was done to me and declares it evil. I need to hear that God is a God of truth and justice and mercy. I need to be told the truth, that wicked, murderous acts of my perpetrator make a mockery of God's covenant. I need to be assured that God's love for me does not deceive, manipulate, mock, threaten, coerce, intimidate, use, dishonor, hurt, violate, or destroy. I need to be told that God's love for me is peace, the exact opposite of what my perpetrator did to me. Instead, again reading as if I were a victim, what I read next caused me more confusion and guilt and shame. Is he accusing me of wallowing in my victimhood, of being bitter? Does this mean that I'd better not tell anyone? Does this mean that bringing my abuser to the civil and church authorities is bitterness? Does this mean that my flashbacks and panic attacks and shaking and weeping at what my body is involuntarily doing is bitter? Does he understand the internal battle of love-hatred for my perpetrator? Does he understand my confusion about how I feel about my perpetrator? That he or she was first my friend, uncle, teacher, and that in some twisted and tormenting way I still have that confused feeling of love and hate for him, and yet at the same time cannot make sense of the betrayal of that deceit. Does he know how much I want to forgive my abuser? Does he understand my constant battle to love, and yet my experience and understanding of love was twisted and weaponized? So for me, to love my abuser is confusing and tormenting. Does that mean my struggle to understand that is bitterness? Is my anger done to me, in fact, bitterness? Are the people in my church judging my cries of pain as a bitter heart? Are people declaring my screams of agony in body, mind, and soul as bitterness? Are there really victims who live an easier life being a victim? I don't want to be a victim. I've never wanted to be a victim. Perhaps Reverend Key in this paragraph is addressing ungodly victims, but that doesn't help me and give me hope and spiritual peace. In the next paragraph, reading it as a non-victim, Reverend Key describes sexual assault as to be made an object of self-serving person's lust. I respectfully submit that that statement is not entirely accurate. The abuser is, maybe even especially, driven by sinful desire for power and control, using deceit and manipulation. Another concern that I have is Reverend Key's phrase, damaged goods in the eyes of many. Reading it as a non-victim, the phrase surprised me. Of the several sexual abuse victims that I personally know, I can honestly say that I have never viewed them as damaged goods. Reading the phrase as a victim, as is his stated intention, is that how people view me? As damaged goods? Oh, the added shame that this adds to me. Finally, again reading this as a victim, the language and analogies of loving embrace, shadow of a companion fall on you, very close to him, bigger than you, spending the night there, cradles us in his arms, holds us, was painfully triggering. These analogies are beautiful truths of God meant for my comfort, but they were used against me by my abuser, and I cannot make sense of these two opposing truths, the truth of God and the experience of abuse. I have confusion and distress in these two opposing realities. If Reverend Key has listened to other victims, does he know how this language does not offer peace? Or am I the only victim who experiences triggers when reading these physical analogies? I believe what Reverend Key wrote is true, but are they true for me? Speaking as a victim who has not yet begun to overcome the trauma, he states not only does he care for us, but he protects us. But God didn't protect us. He didn't protect me night after night. What does God's protection mean then? Reading as a victim, this article left me thinking either that perhaps the author, like many others in the church, have not had the opportunity to interact with and enter into the suffering of a sexual abuse victim, or that my fears are in fact reality. I am unlike all other victims. I am strange. I am alone in regards to the devastation of the abuser's actions, what they have caused me. Now I'm afraid to seek help from anyone because I fear I am all alone in my suffering. Very vigorous interaction with Reverend Key of the Protestant Reformed Church. Turn our attention now to Table Talk, the July issue, expositing Exodus 20 and the law. And we turn now to Shepherding with Hospitality, the weekend devotional of July 23-24, written by Dr. Barry York, President and Professor of Pastoral Theology at Reformed Presbyterian Seminary in Pittsburgh, a covenanting Presbyterian. I like those guys. They've been faithful to their heritage and to the Westminster Confession. Very, very refreshing to see that multi-centennial fidelity. All Christians are to practice hospitality, but elders are to be engaged in the practice such that it characterizes them. In so many words, Paul told Timothy and Titus that the elders not only need to go and seek God's sheep, they also need to bring them into the fold of the shepherd's home. At least 3 benefits come to the congregation when pastors and elders open their homes to the flock. First, hospitality supplies experiential love. An elder's having members of the congregation in his home demonstrates a special care for them. Hi, Dr. Bob. Prof Veach, what article are you reading about abuse? I'm reading from the Standard Bearer. It's the Protestant Reformed Journal. This is the June issue. They're going to do a monthly issue, June, July, August, and then in September they'll go back to their every 2 weeks. And I'm reading it to get in touch and stay in touch with the Protestant Reformed Church. I'm thinking of Homer Hoeksema, Hoeksema's Dogmatics, Hoeksema's, I'm drawing a blank here, triple something. I forget the Hoeksema's first name, Hoeksema. Drawing a blank. Hoeksema, Protestant Reformed Church. I knew his son, Homer Hoeksema, professor of Old Testament, was in his home a few times, and when I was up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, on some travels. They don't believe in common grace. They believe in the unconditionality of the Abrahamic covenant. And there are 3 forms of unity, people. Belgic Confession, Canons of Dort, and Heidelberg Catechism. Very Reformed people. Standard Bearer is the name of it. Don't know what more I can say. It's done by the Reformed Free Publishing Association. $30 per year for a U.S. subscription. And then I think when you do that, you get electronic subscriptions. So maybe that should help you. I think it's a very direct article that the lady who wrote that is Vicki Nosen of Wayland, Michigan. She really kind of rips up the article by Reverend Key written in May. And I read that edition, and my thoughts were, wow, it was pretty direct stuff in the May edition. I don't think I've ever seen that subject addressed with such vigor. And the upshot of the May issue was churches be a haven of safety, have policies in place for Sunday school teachers, for youth workers, for an abusive uncle or an abusive father, or God forbid, an abusive elder. And what do you do when you find that has gone on? What is a form of church discipline? What's it look like? What do you do for the victim and the victim's family? So I think it's a potent, powerful. There's just no place for child abuse, male or female, in God's holy sanctuary. None, zero, de nada, zippo, basta, finito, zero. So how do you deal with that as an elder or elders or senior leaders, men and women? So that was the May issue, and then this is the June issue responding to that. She takes Reverend Key to the shed, to the woodhouse, and it's very nice to see such open exchange in that article. Very strong. Anyways, back to shepherding with hospitality and table talk. The importance. Shepherds are testifying to their congregations that the true shepherd, Jesus, loves them so much that he is preparing an eternal home for them. Psalm 23, 1 and 5. Second, hospitality provides Christian modeling. In my years of pastoral experience, I am grateful that I served alongside elders who are hospitable. Many of the people brought into our congregation by the gospel did not come from Christian homes. By hosting them, the elders provided wonderful models of the gospel in many ways. Elder hospitality gave new Christians the opportunity to see how a believing husband and wife treat one another. Guests witnessed how parents are to raise and discipline their children. They not only heard about family worship, but participated in it. They witnessed what a home devoted to Christ looks like. Being in the home of a shepherd helped them learn more deeply what following Christ requires. Third, hospitality furnishes family. In this broken world of ours, the poor, the stranger, and the widow often live in isolation. When elders provide hospitality to these folks, they learn that they are truly regarded as brothers and sisters in God's house. Jesus has told us to have a special regard for such people as these. When you give a dinner and banquet, Luke 14, 12 to 14, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. How true Jesus' words are. Showing hospitality to a converted, homeless man who once lived under railroad trestles and transformed our congregation in mercy. Caring for the child of a single mother in our homes while she worked and taught us patience and love. Having an elderly widower over for meals led him to find ways to serve rather than to despair. For each one, the church has become their family. On the great day of judgment, Jesus will say to his faithful followers, I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. Matthew 25:35. Elders should live so as to anticipate the blessed affirmation. That's a covenanter, and I would remind or say that we are reading the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Journal of 1837. That's on the menu as they've been working on Romans 8, 1 to 4, and we'll get to that in the course of the day, God willing. For the present, I want to call this to a break and catch up, take a break, and be back a little bit later. Always, always, always good to see you. Mary and Dr. Bob, tremendous. Just good to see you. Be back later. Godspeed.